January, 2020. At first, it seemed like just another news story. A mysterious virus had appeared in a city most people outside China had never heard of. Few imagined it would matter. Fewer still imagined it would change the world. But within months, airports fell silent. Schools closed. Cities locked down. Entire nations stood still. For the first time in modern history, billions of people experienced the same crisis at the same time. People who had spent their entire lives believing the modern world was predictable suddenly discovered how fragile normal life could be. And then, before the world could fully recover, another shock arrived. February 24, 2022. Russian forces crossed into Ukraine. The largest war in Europe since World War II had begun. Many people believed major wars belonged to history books. History disagreed. Then came October 7, 2023. Another conflict erupted in the Middle East. A region already marked by generations of instability was once again consumed by violence. At the same time, something else was happening. Not on battlefields. Not in government buildings. But in ordinary homes. Food prices rose. Fuel prices surged. Families watched grocery bills climb month after month. Millions of people found themselves paying more and receiving less. Then came shortages. Supply chains fractured. Factories slowed. Store shelves emptied. Products people once took for granted suddenly became difficult to find. And while humanity struggled with crisis after crisis, nature seemed to add its own warnings. Historic wildfires. Record-breaking heat. Entire landscapes transformed almost overnight. A pandemic. War. Economic instability. Food insecurity. Death. All within a single decade. Most people see these as separate events. Different causes. Different countries. Different stories. But for nearly 2,000 years, there has been an ancient prophecy that describes a sequence disturbingly similar. Not one disaster. Not two. But four. Conquest. War. Famine. Death. The prophecy calls them the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And the question that refuses to disappear is this: are they still coming? Or have they already arrived? Most people think the Four Horsemen are four separate disasters. They're not. At least, that's not how the vision presents them. Because hidden inside the prophecy is a pattern that changes everything. A pattern most people never notice. And once you see it, it's difficult to unsee. The riders arrive in sequence. One after another. Almost like falling dominoes. Which raises a fascinating possibility. What if the prophecy is not simply predicting future events? What if it is revealing how civilizations collapse? To understand that possibility, we need to begin with the first rider. The rider on the white horse. Surprisingly, he does not look terrifying. There are no flames. No monsters. No rivers of blood. Instead, he appears victorious. Successful. Triumphant. And that may be exactly what makes him dangerous. Throughout history, some of humanity's greatest disasters began with promises. Promises of security. Promises of prosperity. Promises of national greatness. Promises that everything would be better. Think about the greatest empires in history. Very few began by announcing destruction. Most began by promising progress. Something strange happens when historians study great collapses. The disaster rarely begins with war. It rarely begins with famine. And it almost never begins with death. Instead, It usually begins with success. Or at least the appearance of success. The Roman Empire. Napoleonic France. The British Empire. Even modern superpowers. The greatest crises often emerge at the very moment people believe everything is under control. Which suddenly makes the first horseman far more unsettling. Not every victory leads somewhere good. Sometimes the most dangerous events arrive dressed as success. And once that process begins, another rider often follows. The second horseman emerges on a red horse. Unlike the first, his purpose is unmistakable. War. Violence. Conflict. Yet there is a detail many people overlook. The prophecy does not simply say that war arrives. It says peace is taken away. Think about that. War doesn't arrive. Peace leaves. And that distinction changes everything. Because conflict rarely appears overnight. Trust collapses. Fear spreads. Divisions deepen. And eventually violence fills the space where peace once lived. History has repeated this pattern again and again. Empires rise. Tensions grow. Peace weakens. War follows. Civilization feels permanent when we are living inside it. But history tells a different story. Peace is precious because it is fragile. And once it disappears, the consequences can echo for generations. But the red horse is not the end of the story. In many ways. It is only the beginning. Because war rarely rides alone. Behind it comes another figure. And before we meet that rider, we need to ask an important question. Have the horsemen ridden before? Because one reason the Four Horsemen continue to fascinate people is that every generation believes it may be living through the prophecy. And surprisingly, this is not a new phenomenon. People have been asking the same question for nearly 2,000 years. Again and again. History seemed to provide reasons. Consider the world in which Revelation was first written. The Roman Empire. To the people living at that time, Rome appeared unstoppable. Its armies conquered nations. Its roads connected continents. Its power seemed permanent. The empire looked invincible. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Political corruption. Economic instability. Internal conflict. Military pressure from outside enemies. The foundations were weakening long before most people noticed. And over time, the empire that seemed eternal began to crumble. Many early Christians looked around and saw echoes of the horsemen. Not because they had solved every mystery of prophecy. But because the pattern felt familiar. Power. Conflict. Decline. Suffering. The same sequence appeared to be unfolding before their eyes. Then came another catastrophe. One that would terrify an entire continent. The year was 1347. Ships arrived in Europe carrying an invisible passenger. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then people began to die. Thousands became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became millions. Entire villages disappeared. Families vanished. Some estimates suggest that nearly 1/3 of Europe's population perished during the Black Death. Imagine living through that. Imagine waking up every morning uncertain whether your friends, your neighbors, or even your own family would still be alive by nightfall. For many people, the fourth horseman seemed impossible to ignore. Death appeared to be riding openly across the world. And yet, history continued. Centuries later, another figure emerged. Napoleon Bonaparte. A brilliant military leader. A conqueror. A man whose victories reshaped Europe. Many admired him. Many celebrated him. His rise appeared unstoppable. But conquest rarely travels alone. His campaigns left devastation across the continent. Millions suffered. Millions died. And once again, some observers saw the familiar sequence. Conquest. War. Suffering. Death. The pattern seemed to return. Then came the 20th century. A century unlike anything humanity had experienced before. Scientific breakthroughs. Industrial progress. Technological innovation. Many believed civilization had entered a new age. A more enlightened age. A more rational age. A safer age. Then came World War I. More than 16 million people lost their lives. The world was horrified. Surely, many thought, humanity would never allow such destruction again. Then came the Great Depression. Economic collapse spread across nations. Families lost homes. Businesses failed. Entire economies struggled to survive. And before the wounds could heal, World War II erupted. More than 60 million lives were lost. Entire cities became rubble. Nations were devastated. Humanity witnessed horrors almost beyond comprehension. And once again, people turned to revelation. Searching for answers. Searching for meaning. Searching for hope. Yet perhaps the most fascinating thing about all these periods is this. Every generation believed it was seeing the final fulfillment. Every generation believed the signs were obvious. Every generation was convinced the end had arrived. Yet history continued. The world continued. Life continued. Which teaches an important lesson. Prophecy is often easier to recognize in hindsight than in real time. Think about that. If the Four Horsemen appeared today, would people recognize them? Or would they debate endlessly while the events unfolded around them? History suggests the answer might not be as obvious as we think. And perhaps that is why the conversation has returned in our own time. Because once again, the world feels uncertain. Once again, people sense that something is changing. Once again, the old questions are being asked. But history wasn't finished with the horsemen. Not even close. In fact, the rider we are about to meet may be the one modern society understands least. And yet his shadow may already be falling across the world today. The Black Horse. Of all the riders, this one may be the easiest to misunderstand. When people hear the word famine, they often imagine barren fields. Empty granaries. Starving populations. But famine rarely begins that way. It begins with imbalance. The black horse carries a pair of scales. At first glance, it seems like a strange symbol. Why scales? Why not a sword? Why not a weapon? Because the danger this rider represents is different. The scales symbolize measurement. Calculation. Scarcity. A world where resources become limited and every decision carries a cost. Think about the last few years. Not necessarily famine in its most extreme form. But something that felt strangely familiar. Supply chains broke down. Food prices increased. Fuel costs surged. Products that once seemed abundant became harder to obtain. For many people, it was the first glimpse of a reality previous generations knew well. The realization that prosperity is not guaranteed. That abundance can disappear more quickly than we imagine. And perhaps that is one reason the black horse feels so relevant today. Not because most people are starving. But because many are beginning to understand how fragile the systems around them really are. The modern world depends on countless connections. Factories. Shipping routes. Power grids. Financial systems. Global trade. When those systems function properly, life feels normal. But when they begin to fail, even slightly, the effects can ripple across entire nations. A delayed shipment in one country. A conflict in another. A drought somewhere else. And suddenly prices rise. Resources shrink. Uncertainty spreads. The Black Horse reminds us that civilization often rests on foundations we rarely notice until they begin to crack. And when scarcity appears, something else usually follows. Fear. People become anxious. Communities become divided. Trust begins to weaken. History has shown this repeatedly. Scarcity does not simply affect economies. It affects human behavior. It changes how people think. How they act. How they treat one another. One crisis creates another. One domino knocks over the next. And eventually, the sequence leads to the final rider. The pale horse. Unlike the others, this horseman is given a name. Death. No mystery. No symbolism. No uncertainty. Just death. And perhaps that is why he is often considered the most terrifying of all. Because the pale horse does not arrive first. He arrives last. He follows everything that came before. Conquest. War. Scarcity. And then death. Think about how different that is from the way most people imagine disaster. We often think of death as the event itself. But Revelation presents it differently. Death is the consequence. The destination. The final result of a chain reaction already set in motion. And that detail may be more important than many realize. Because perhaps the most frightening part of the Four Horsemen is not any individual rider. It is the order. Think about it. If Revelation had simply listed random catastrophes, the prophecy would be far less remarkable. But that is not what it does. Instead, it presents a sequence. A progression. A pattern. One rider creates the conditions for the next. The next opens the door for another. Like dominoes falling. One after another. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Revelation is not merely predicting events? What if it is revealing how civilizations fail? Consider the great civilizations of history. The Roman Empire. The Persian Empire. The Ottoman Empire. The British Empire. Each believed its influence would endure. Each believed its foundations were strong. Each believed it would continue. Yet none of them lasted forever. History is filled with civilizations that thought they were permanent. And perhaps that is why the Four Horsemen continue to capture the human imagination. Not because they represent the end of the world. But because they remind us that no civilization is immune to decline. No society is invincible. No nation is guaranteed tomorrow. Maybe the prophecy endures because it speaks to something every generation eventually discovers. The fragility of human achievement. The illusion of control. The uncomfortable reality that everything built by human hands can be shaken. And perhaps that realization brings us to the most important question of all. If the Four Horsemen represent war, scarcity, uncertainty, and death, what is a Christian supposed to do? Because Revelation was never written merely to satisfy curiosity. It was never intended to become a puzzle that believers spend centuries trying to solve. It was written to encourage faith. Especially during difficult times. Especially during uncertain times. Especially during times that look frightening. One of the most remarkable things about biblical prophecy is that it never encourages panic. Think about that. Many people approach prophecy with fear. Yet Jesus repeatedly pointed his followers in a different direction. He spoke about wars. He spoke about famines. He spoke about turmoil among nations. He spoke about events that would shake the world. Yet his instruction was surprisingly simple. Do not be alarmed. Not denial. Not ignorance. Not pretending problems do not exist. Trust. Confidence in God even when circumstances seem uncertain. The first Christians who read Revelation understood this better than most. They were not living in comfort. They were not surrounded by security. Many faced persecution. Some faced imprisonment. Others faced death. Yet the message of Revelation was never escape hardship. The message was remain faithful. Again and again, believers are called to endure. To persevere. To trust God when the future feels unclear. And perhaps that message matters today just as much as it did then. Because every generation faces uncertainty. The details change. The technology changes. The headlines change. But uncertainty remains. And so does the need for faith. When the world experiences fear, Christians are called to bring hope. When people are consumed by anxiety, Christians are called to demonstrate peace. When others become selfish during times of scarcity, Christians are called to show generosity. When hatred spreads, Christians are called to love. When darkness grows, Christians are called to shine. Perhaps that is one reason God gives prophecy in the first place. Not so believers can predict every future event. But so they can respond differently when difficult events occur. And perhaps the most important truth of all is this. The Four Horsemen are not the main characters of Revelation. Many people talk about the writers. Few talk about the one who opens the seals. Think about that for a moment. The horsemen do not appear on their own. They appear because the seals are opened. And the one opening those seals is Christ himself. That changes everything. Because the central message of Revelation is not chaos. It is sovereignty. Not fear. But hope. Not the triumph of darkness. But the ultimate victory of God. Many people read Revelation and become fascinated by beasts, judgments, signs, and symbols. Yet the book begins with a revelation of Jesus Christ. And it ends with Jesus Christ. He is the center of the story. Not the horseman. Not the Antichrist. Not the disasters. Christ. The risen King. The one who was dead and is alive forevermore. The one who holds authority over history itself. And perhaps that is the detail many people miss. The purpose of Revelation is not to make believers afraid. It is to remind believers who remains on the throne. Even when the world seems out of control. Even when nations rage. Even when economies tremble. Even when uncertainty grows. God remains God. Christ remains King. And history remains in his hands. So, are the Four Horsemen already here? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Faithful Christians have debated that question for centuries. Some believe these riders belong primarily to the future. Others believe they have been riding through human history for generations. The debate will likely continue. But regardless of where someone stands, the response remains the same. Trust God. Remain faithful. Love others. Stand firm. Walk in hope. Because the ultimate message of Revelation is not that darkness wins. It is that Christ wins. Perhaps the reason the Four Horsemen have survived in human memory for nearly 2,000 years is not because they predict the future. Perhaps they endure because they reveal something timeless. The fragility of civilization. The limits of human power. The reality of suffering. And the enduring need for faith. Maybe the question was never, are the Four Horsemen already here? Maybe the real question is, if they arrived, would we even recognize them? And if we did, would we still trust the one who holds history in his hands? Because long after empires rise and fall, long after wars begin and end, long after every kingdom of this world has passed away, one kingdom remains. One king remains. And that is where the Christian's hope has always been. Not in the strength of nations. Not in the stability of economies. Not in the certainty of tomorrow. But in Christ. The Alpha and the Omega. The beginning and the end. The King who was. Who is. And who is to come. Do not be afraid. For I am the first and the last.